There is a 5-word sentence that has been bouncing around the corridors of Windsor Castle, spilling into the ears of palace insiders, leaking out to the press.
There is a sentence that has been repeated so many times inside the walls of Thornmere Palace that nobody can quite remember who said it first. 5 words. And once you understand who finally said them out loud and who they were said to, you will understand why the balance of power inside the royal house of Aldmore changed forever on a Tuesday evening in October. In a gallery most of the staff didn't even know had been reopened. This is a story about a debt. It was owed for 22 years, and it was paid, finally, not with a statement, not with a scandal, but with a painting, a phone call, and a woman who had spent 2 decades saying almost nothing at all. Let's start at the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. For over 20 years, a portrait of Princess Ilara of Aldmore sat wrapped in linen in a climate-controlled storage room 3 floors beneath the east wing of Thornmere Palace. It was not a minor work. It had been commissioned during what royal historians call the height of Ilara's public life, back when she was quietly becoming the most photographed woman on the continent. And it had originally been intended for the long gallery, the ceremonial corridor, where the portraits of the kingdom's most significant royal women have hung for 3 centuries. Ambassadors walk past that gallery. Prime ministers pass through it before state dinners. It is not decoration. It is a statement about who the monarchy considers essential to its own story. Ilara's portrait was supposed to be part of that statement. People who were in the room when she first saw the finished canvas have described a stillness that came over her, not disappointment, but something closer to recognition, as though the painter had found a truth about her she hadn't expected to see reflected back. She died in a car accident on a rain-slicked coastal road 11 months later, and in the chaos and grief that followed a funeral procession that reportedly stopped traffic across 4 cities, the portrait was quietly pulled from the schedule for installation. It went into storage instead. It stayed there for 22 years. Ask yourself why. A princess whose funeral drew millions to line the streets, whose charity work with flood-displaced families is still taught in Aldmore schools, had her portrait removed from consideration for a wall of honor and left in the dark for over 2 decades. Not loaned elsewhere. Not displayed in a smaller room. Stored. That question sits at the center of everything that follows. The public mourning in the weeks after Ilara's death was enormous, and it was genuine. But inside the palace, a different story was unfolding. Royal staff who worked at Thornmere during that period have described in interviews given years later a household reorganizing itself with unusual speed. Some of it was procedural. Some of it, they say, was something else. Ilara's replacement in the family's emotional geography arrived in the form of Duchess Vivienne, a woman who had been part of Prince Consort Edmund's life for years before Ilara's death, in a relationship the palace had never acknowledged, but everyone inside it understood. Ilara had a name for her, one she used only with her closest friends, the Frost. Not because Vivienne was unintelligent, Ilara knew exactly how sharp she was, but because of how completely Vivienne could freeze a room without raising her voice. After Ilara died, Vivienne began moving through the spaces that had belonged to her. And the distinction that matters here is this: she didn't simply occupy those rooms, she erased what was in them. Ilara had kept fresh larkspur in her private sitting room, her favorite flower, chosen and arranged personally, the kind of small detail that turns a palace apartment into something that feels like an actual home. Staff say the arrangements were removed, not given away, burned. There is a meaningful difference between discarding something and destroying it, and the household staff at the time understood exactly which instruction they'd been given. Ilara's private study, the room where she'd written letters to the families she supported, where she'd sat awake on nights she couldn't sleep, was ordered sealed. Not redecorated, not reassigned, sealed, with the understanding that no one would use it again, including Vivienne herself. She had no interest in the room. She simply ensured nobody else could have it either. Ilara's photographs began disappearing from the more visible corridors of the palace, not all at once, but gradually. One frame moved to a smaller hallway, another relocated to a service corridor, a third simply gone. By the time anyone thought to ask where they'd all ended up, There was no single decision to point to, and the long gallery stood with an empty space on its wall where Ilara's face was supposed to be. Prince Rowan was 14 when he walked behind his mother's funeral carriage through the streets of the capital, his face arranged into an expression that gave the cameras nothing. What people forget, looking back at that image now, is that he wasn't a child who didn't understand what had happened. He understood most of it already. Ilara had sat him down months earlier and explained, as gently as the truth allowed, that his father had never really left Vivienne, not even during the marriage. His younger brother, Prince Callum, found out differently watching a documentary about the family with his mother when Vivienne's name and face appeared on screen, and asking who she was. Ilara had to explain it to an 8-year-old in real time, with no warning and no gentler version available. But the thing that hardened permanently in Rowan didn't come from either conversation. It came from a letter. 2 years before her death, Ilara had written to her solicitor expressing a fear one the later inquest examined and ultimately dismissed as unfounded that the brakes on the car she typically used had been tampered with. The letter sat unopened in a filing cabinet for nearly 5 years before it reached investigators. The official inquiry found no evidence supporting her fear. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. This isn't a story claiming she was right. It's a story about how frightened she'd been and how long it took anyone to even look at what she'd written down. And it's a story about the fact that her son eventually read it. Watch every decision Rowan made in the following 2 decades, because that letter is the context for all of them. He watched Vivienne move into his mother's spaces. He watched the photographs vanish. He watched the empty space on the long gallery wall at every state banquet, every holiday reception, every ceremonial occasion for 22 years. He counted the faces on that wall and knew exactly which one was missing. In public, his expression never moved. At 16, he reportedly broke that discipline exactly once, telling a trusted aide that Vivienne had gotten her hold on his father and never let go, and that it had cost his mother the safety she should have had. He never repeated it to anyone who could use it against him. That's the thing people underestimated about Rowan. He learned at 14 that saying a true thing at the wrong time gets you nothing but a headline. So he waited. Rowan wasn't the only person in the family carrying a wound with Vivienne's name on it. His aunt, Princess Beatrix, Ilara's sister-in-law and the second child of the reigning monarch, had one that predated Ilara entirely. Before Vivienne married into the Aldmore circle through her long relationship with Edmund, she had, years earlier, been involved with a man named Julian Ashworth, a diplomat's son Beatrix herself had loved and hoped to marry. The family's religious constitution at the time barred Beatrix from marrying outside the state church, and Julian's family didn't meet that requirement. She was told no by the same institution she'd given her whole life to. She stepped aside, because that's what Beatrix has always done when the family required it of her. Vivienne, unrelated to that decision at first, ended up with Julian within the year. Beatrix sat in a pew at their wedding and gave nothing away. That is the fact. Everything else about Beatrix has to be read against. She doesn't create scenes. She doesn't leak grievances to friendly reporters. She files things away, sometimes for decades, and waits. Years later, when Vivienne, now married to Edmund and eventually elevated to princess consort herself, crossed paths again with Beatrix at official functions, biographers who've studied the family have noted a specific chill in Beatrix's manner toward her, one unlike anything she showed anyone else. It wasn't rudeness. It was precision. Beatrix was never once impolite enough to give Vivienne anything to complain about, and never once warm enough to suggest forgiveness. 50 years of correct, glacial distance Rowan didn't walk into the long gallery with a painting under his arm on impulse. He spent the better part of a year in quiet meetings with the palace's chief curator, working through the historical protocol governing portrait placement, making sure that when Ilara's portrait went up, there would be no administrative mechanism left to take it back down. He wanted it legally, procedurally, unassailable. He'd been playing a long game inside his own family, and this was the move the whole game had been building toward. The night before it happened, he called his aunt. The conversation was short. Neither of them needed it to be long. Beatrix said it was long overdue. She said Ilara deserved to come home. Rowan told her it would happen the next evening. That was the entire call, 2 people in separate wings of the same palace, a combined 70 years of practiced silence, agreeing in under a minute to do the one thing nobody in that household had ever dared attempt out loud. Vivienne had no idea any of it was coming. She had spent 2 decades believing the matter was settled, permanently, in her favor. The planning was too careful to have been anything but deliberate. Vivienne had a long-scheduled engagement that afternoon, 2 hours outside the capital, nothing unusual, nothing that would have raised questions, and nothing she could abandon on short notice once she realized what was happening. The long gallery was closed for what staff were told was routine conservation work. A small group of people who understood exactly what they were part of were the only ones allowed inside. Nothing appeared on the official schedule. No statement was drafted. There was no plan to announce anything at all, which tells you this was never meant to be a public gesture. It was meant to simply become true. In the early evening, the portrait was carried up from storage. Staff who were there that night describe handling it with a specific, deliberate gentleness, the kind reserved for something that had already been damaged once. Beatrix was present. Not because the process required her, but because after 22 years, she intended to watch it happen with her own eyes. When the linen wrapping finally came off, Ilara's portrait was visible in full for the first time in over 2 decades, in the room it had always been meant for. Beatrix had known that face since it was young. She'd been part of the family before Ilara arrived in it, and she'd watched the whole arc from a few feet away. The wedding, the strain, the public grief. The funeral. When the wrapping came off, she wasn't looking at an icon. She was looking, she reportedly told someone afterward, at a girl she'd watched the family fail to protect. The frame was measured, leveled, checked twice. Within roughly 90 minutes, Ilara's portrait was mounted beside the formal portrait of the current Queen Mother, 2 women, side by side, where both had always belonged. Nobody in the room spoke for a long moment. And then Beatrix, almost to herself, said, "She belongs here. She always did." Present tense, as though the missing decades had simply been a clerical error, now corrected. Vivienne returned to the palace that night with no idea what was hanging in the long gallery. She found out the next morning. Staff who were nearby that day describe her reaction as immediate. She demanded the portrait be removed at once, demanded a meeting with Rowan, demanded Edmund intervene personally, demanded to know exactly who had been inside the gallery the night before. Every demand was refused, including the last one, and that last one is the most telling. She didn't just want the painting gone. She wanted names. That's not what someone asks for when they want a picture moved. That's what someone asks for when they intend to deal with the people responsible, the way she'd historically dealt with anyone who hadn't followed her preferences. But the hardest part of that morning, by every account, wasn't the refused demands. It was Edmund. He had spent decades defending his relationship with Vivienne against institutional resistance and public disapproval, had absorbed his son's open disappointment in him for years. He had always, eventually, been the one who intervened on her behalf. This time, he made no phone call. He didn't challenge Rowan's decision. He let the portrait stay exactly where it was. With his silence, he handed the entire cost of that decision to the person standing in front of him, waiting for a rescue that never came. Later that same day, Beatrix reportedly walked into the room where Vivienne was still waiting for someone to fix it. She came alone, with no witnesses. She looked at the woman who had ordered the flowers burned, who had sealed Ilara's study, who had watched the photographs disappear for 22 years and never once asked where they'd gone. And she said 5 words. It is what she deserved. Past tense, a debt long outstanding, now stated as settled. Then she turned and left. The story didn't stay contained to the palace for long. 5 words spoken in an empty gallery at Thornmere are the kind of detail that finds its way into print eventually, and when it did, it spread fast. But the more lasting change wasn't the headline. It was what happened afterward, quietly. Vivienne was dropped, without explanation, from a string of upcoming engagements. Programs Ilara had championed, particularly her Flood Relief Foundation, which had gone quiet for years, began reappearing under Rowan and his wife's patronage. Palace Communications mentioned Ilara's name more in the 2 weeks following the portrait's installation than in the previous 2 years combined. That is not sentiment. That is signal, and inside a royal household, signals like that don't tend to reverse. None of this makes sense without understanding what kind of man Rowan turned out to be, not the version offered up at ceremonial appearances, but the one underneath it. He was 16 when he formed a settled view of what had been done to his mother, and that view never moved. He was simply, unlike some others in his position, disciplined enough to conceal it for as long as concealing it served him. He chose patience as his instrument, learning the institution's own rules well enough that no one could use them against him, then acting once, cleanly, at a moment of his own choosing, in a way that couldn't be undone by anyone who might have wanted to undo it. Ilara's portrait hangs now in the long gallery at Thornmere Palace, beside the Queen Mother's, exactly where it always should have. Rowan was 14 when he walked behind his mother's funeral carriage and made himself a promise he didn't have words for yet. Then he did the hardest thing an angry teenager can do: nothing for over 20 years, while quietly building something underneath that nobody could shift once it was finished. And when he was finally ready, he brought in the one person in the family with both the history and the nerve to make it permanent.